It was the spring of 1956 when the bells of St. Agatha's Cathedral rang for morning mass, but something felt wrong that day. The pews filled slowly with whispers, glances, and questions that no one dared speak aloud. Bishop Edward Halstead, a man beloved for his gentleness and revered for his unwavering devotion, had not arrived. Nor had Thomas Bell, the 13-year-old choir boy known for his angelic voice and the way he always arrived early to polish the brass candlesticks. The clock struck 9. The hymns began without them. And just like that, they were gone, without a trace, without a goodbye. For 4 decades, their disappearance became the sacred wound of the town. No signs, no clues, just 2 lives carved in a stained glass memory, and a growing ache that hovered like incense in every service that followed. Some whispered of foul play. Others feared divine judgment. But the cathedral stood tall, stoic, as if holding its breath through every passing year. The passage of time turned grief into folklore, and folklore into silence. Until one ordinary Tuesday, when renovation crews uncovered something beneath the marble floor of the chancel, a narrow, dust-choked stairway that had never appeared on any blueprint. At the bottom, they found a door, small, iron-latched, and sealed shut by layers of time. No one could have imagined what lay behind it. The space was cramped, built of stone and candle soot. And in the corner, beneath a rotted choir robe and a rusted crucifix, were 2 wooden chairs. On one rested a bishop's ring. On the other, a child's silver cross. It wasn't just a room. It was a secret kept by the cathedral itself. And in that instant, 40 years of questions rose like ash into the daylight. But this wasn't just a mystery solved by bones and relics. The journals found inside that room told a different story. A deeper one that revealed not crime, but choice. Not tragedy, but transformation. What the bishop and the boy left behind wasn't horror. It was a message, carved in ink and sorrow, and something that might have been grace. And the words they left behind would rattle the foundations of faith, family, and forgiveness for generations to come. Why would a bishop and a choir boy disappear into the belly of cathedral? What did they hope to find, or protect, beneath the very place meant to offer sanctuary? And why did they never try to escape? This is not just a story of vanishing. It is a story of what we choose to bury, and what comes roaring back to life when the world finally starts to listen. The investigation in 1956 was thorough, but ultimately fruitless. Authorities searched every corner of St. Agatha's Cathedral, from the bell tower to the crypt. Volunteers combed through the nearby woods, and divers scoured the nearby river. The bishop's quarters remained untouched, his robe still folded neatly on the bed, his Bible open to Psalms. Thomas's schoolbooks were found stacked on a pew, with a handwritten hymn tucked inside, marked with his careful handwriting. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of escape, only absence, and a silence too loud to ignore. As days turned into months, the story of their disappearance took on a life of its own. Parishioners whispered theories between candlelit services. Some believed they had fled, perhaps to escape a scandal too shameful to surface. Others insisted it was divine, that God had taken them for reasons beyond understanding. But the pain lingered, especially for Thomas's mother, who refused to leave her son's room untouched. Every Christmas, she would light a candle in the cathedral's front pew and sing his favorite carol beneath the stained glass window that bore his likeness. She never missed a year. Decades passed. The cathedral aged with quiet dignity. Cracks spread like veins through the stone floor. The pews became more worn. And yet, no one forgot. When the diocese finally approved restoration work in 1996, it wasn't because they had given up. It was because they needed to preserve what remained. The lead architect, Maria Thorne, a lapsed Catholic herself, was drawn to the cathedral for reasons she couldn't explain. She later admitted she felt something waiting beneath the floor. Not evil, not holy, just waiting. When workers uncovered the hidden stairway, they paused all renovations. Dust and debris had nearly sealed the entrance completely. The air that poured from below was cold and dry, untouched for decades. Maria stood at the edge of the stairwell and whispered, "We're not just rebuilding, we're revealing." The crew descended with flashlights and reverence, aware they were stepping into a place time had forgotten. What they found wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. A room prepared, organized, preserved. Not a prison, not a tomb. Something in between. Inside that room, the light flickered over faint writing on the stone wall. Latin prayers, fragments of verses, and a single line in English carved into the wood above the chairs. "We are not lost. We are listening." The phrase chilled them, not because it sounded desperate, but because it sounded certain. And in that moment, every theory, every rumor, every page of the cold case was reduced to this simple, haunting truth. They hadn't vanished. They had chosen to stay. The question was, why? The journals discovered in the hidden room were wrapped in cloth, stacked neatly inside a weathered trunk beside a rusted lantern. There were 6 in total, 3 written in the bishop's hand, 3 in the uneven, heartfelt scrawl of young Thomas. The pages were brittle, but the ink had held. The first entries were dated just days before their disappearance, and what they contained would shake the foundations of everything the church and the town believed about that day. These weren't logs. They were confessions, and they began with a revelation no one had expected. Bishop Halstead had written of dreams, recurring, vivid, almost prophetic. He spoke of a figure cloaked in light who appeared to him in the sanctuary, always standing near the altar, never speaking. The bishop, a man of unwavering theology, began to feel something unraveling inside his doctrine. The visions didn't frighten him, but they unmade him. He questioned whether he had spent his life leading people to comfort instead of truth. And one night, in a moment of silence so deep it felt eternal, he wrote, "I no longer know if I serve the church or the one who made it." Thomas's entries mirrored a different kind of transformation. He spoke of hearing songs at night when no one else was in the cathedral, notes that weren't written in any hymnal, melodies that stirred something ancient in his chest. He wrote about moments when time seemed to slow during Mass, when he felt the statues watching not with judgment, but with grief. One particular entry read, "I think the bishop hears them too. We don't talk about it, but I know." This wasn't hysteria. This was awakening, and they were both being called. As the entries continued, a new tone emerged, one of surrender, not to despair, but to a kind of deeper knowing. The bishop described walking the halls at night, praying not for guidance, but for permission. Permission to let go of titles. Permission to step beyond the rituals and into the mystery. Thomas, too, wrote a feeling that something was coming. A choice. He called it the door beneath the song. The final entries from both journals aligned with eerie synchronicity. We are going below, not to hide, but to listen. If we do not return, it is because we were never meant to be found. What drove them to step into that hidden space beneath the cathedral was not fear, it was invitation. They weren't running from scandal. They were responding to something they believed was holy, something outside doctrine, outside explanation, a calling only they heard. And the fact that they remained, for 40 years, without sending a word, without reaching out, without fleeing, it wasn't a sign of madness. It was a message, one written in silence, one that only now, all these decades later, the world had finally begun to hear. As news of the hidden room spread, the town changed. Reporters came, cameras flashed, headlines screamed of a secret cult, dark rites, and a bishop gone mad. But those who took the time to read the journals felt something different, something unexplainable stirring just beneath the surface. The language in the writings wasn't cryptic. It was yearning. Each line carried the weight of 2 souls trying to reconcile the divine with the unbearable silence that surrounded it. This wasn't the story of a fall from grace. It was the story of 2 people falling toward something the world wasn't ready to understand. One of the most disturbing details wasn't what was in the journals, but what was missing. For nearly 20 years, the entries were consistent. Then suddenly, nothing. An entire decade with no recorded thoughts. And then, just one line scratched into the final page of the bishop's last journal. We heard the voice again. This time, it asked us to stay not for ourselves, but for who would come next. The implications were unsettling. They hadn't just disappeared into the hidden room. They had remained there with purpose. What kind of faith or force could anchor someone in a sealed room beneath stone for 40 years? Investigators expected to find human remains, evidence of starvation or despair. But the room told another story. There were signs of life continuing. Empty lanterns refilled, blank pages replenished, candles replaced. Someone, or something, had provided. There was no rot, no dust on the journals, no signs of neglect. The atmosphere was eerie, yes, but not malignant. The space felt kept. And then there was the question of the door. According to blueprints dating back over 200 years, the hidden stairwell should not have existed. The stone beneath the cathedral was solid. Yet there it was, a passage opened not by dynamite or machinery, but time. Or perhaps something more. The lead architect, Maria, stated in her final report, "We didn't uncover it. It revealed itself." I no longer believe this was a place meant to be found with eyes. She left the project 2 weeks later, returning to her hometown and never speaking publicly again. Meanwhile, the townspeople gathered in silence outside the cathedral, not for spectacle, but for reflection. Those who had once dismissed the bishop's disappearance as shameful now felt the haunting beauty of his final act. He hadn't run. He hadn't broken. He had chosen silence over certainty, depth over doctrine. A boy and a bishop had vanished, but in truth, they had entered something. A space so sacred, so removed from noise, that perhaps only now, 40 years later, could its door be opened by those willing to listen. Soon, whispers of others who had once heard strange things in the cathedral began to surface. A former janitor confessed that he had avoided the lower corridors after dark, claiming he'd heard humming through the walls. A nun recalled a moment, years ago, when she had seen two silhouettes moving beneath the stained glass during a midnight prayer, but no one was scheduled to be there. These confessions had always been dismissed, buried beneath layers of reason. But now, they were being re-examined, not as hallucinations, but as warnings. Or perhaps, invitations that had not been accepted. The community's elders spoke of a legend, long forgotten, about the listening stone, a mythical place beneath sacred ground where the veil between heaven and earth grew thin. It was never taken seriously. But when the bishop's final carvings were found behind the wooden chairs, one line stood out. "This is where the veil trembles." For many, that was the moment when the story ceased being tragedy and became something sacred, something they didn't yet understand, but could no longer deny. Children began asking different questions. Not why did they leave, but what did they hear? In the town school, a teacher placed a copy of Thomas's early writings on the wall, not as curriculum, but as a kind of prayer. His innocent reflections, describing light that hummed, silence that pressed, and a love too big to carry alone, didn't sound like the ramblings of a lost child. They sounded like the heart of someone who had seen something none of us were meant to explain. As more people read the journals, one thing became clear. Bishop Halstead and Thomas didn't just disappear from the world. They descended into it, into a place not marked on any map, where the walls whispered and silence became language. Their sacrifice, if it can even be called that, was not martyrdom. It was guardianship, a choice to leave behind everything familiar in exchange for something eternal, something no one else had dared to face, much less embrace. And now, with the discovery of that room, the world was faced with the same question they had answered 4 decades earlier. Would you listen long enough to hear what silence is trying to say? Not every mystery exists to be solved. Some exist to awaken something long buried in us, a longing for what is beyond explanation, a yearning for the sacred just beyond sound, and perhaps a quiet reminder that some of the loudest truths are only heard when we are finally still. Inside one of Thomas's journals, an entry stood out for its rawness and simplicity. He wrote, "Sometimes I miss the sky." It was one of the few moments where the ache of his choice cracked through the reverence. He wasn't writing out of regret, but out of remembrance. That line, just 5 words, struck a chord with readers everywhere. For all the mystery, for all the awe of the hidden room, it was this boy's quiet longing that made the story human. He had left behind a world he still loved, not to escape it, but to hold space for something beyond it. Bishop Halstead responded to that entry days later in his own journal. "We miss what is bright, but we are not in darkness. There is light here. It just is not asked to be seen, only to be honored." Their writings have become dialogue, not just between a man and a boy, but between two souls navigating the unbearable weight of unseen purpose. These were not two victims buried by time. They were volunteers in a silence no one else had dared to carry. And they had done it together. The room had become more than a tomb. It was now a mirror, a reflection of what it means to say yes to the unknown, a reflection of what it means to stay, not because you're trapped, but because you believe something sacred is listening back. Those who had dismissed the story now returned to the cathedral not with questions, but with reverence. Because the deeper you read, the more it became clear. This wasn't just about two people who went missing. It was about all of us, and the things we bury beneath the noise. In the weeks that followed, letters began arriving from all over the world. Not to the bishop, not to Thomas, but to the silence. People wrote confessions, regrets, hopes. They addressed them to the room beneath, to those who stayed, and even to the voice that doesn't shout. Some left flowers at the base of the cathedral. Others sent small stones with prayers carved into them. No one instructed this. It was instinctive, as if the hidden space beneath St. Agatha's had awoken something sacred in everyone it touched, something unspoken, but deeply familiar. And while many still debated what the voice was, or if there ever was one, those who felt the story knew better. The voice may not have spoken in language. It may not have been divine in the traditional sense, but it had been real. And those two souls had heard it clearly enough to give their lives to it. They weren't asking to be believed. They weren't even asking to be found. They were asking a much harder thing, for the world to remember how to listen. The cathedral remained open, but the room beneath was sealed again, not out of fear, but out of respect. It wasn't meant to become an exhibit. It wasn't meant for tours or documentaries. It had served its purpose. It had revealed what it needed to. And now, like the bishop and the boy, it had returned to stillness. What lingered wasn't the room itself, but the questions it left behind. And perhaps that was always the point, to leave us not with answers, but with a new kind of awareness. Thomas had written one last phrase on the back cover of his final journal, a sentence so faint it almost went unnoticed. When they open the door, tell them we're already inside. Not trapped, not hiding. Inside. Inside the silence. Inside the truth. Inside every heart that dares to believe that sacred things can be real, even if they defy explanation. It was a statement of presence, of legacy, of something unseen that continues, not because it's proven, but because it is remembered. The bishop's final entry was even more haunting. We did not stay because we were lost. We stayed because you would be. It read like prophecy, not of doom, but of longing for a world drowning in noise to finally pause and look inward. He knew the world above would forget, would get busy, would move on. But he also believed, without any need for recognition, that one day the door would open and someone would understand. And in that moment, everything would change. Outside the cathedral, a new tradition quietly began. Each year, on the day of their disappearance, people would gather not to speak, but to listen. No music, no sermons, just silence. Long, aching, holy silence. And in that stillness, many said they heard things. Not voices, but memories, emotions, echoes of decisions unmade. Some cried, others smiled. A few simply closed their eyes. Because in a world that screams for attention, silence had become the last remaining sacred space. And it had taken a bishop and a boy to remind them of its worth. And as that silence spread into homes, into schools, into the hearts of strangers reading weathered journal pages across oceans, it carried with it the heartbeat of something eternal. Not dramatic, not loud, just constant, just true. A voice that had waited 40 years to be heard again. And now that it had, it wasn't going away. In one of the later journal entries, dated over 20 years after their descent, Thomas wrote, "I sometimes wonder what my voice sounds like now." The sentence hit readers like a whisper inside a cavern. Deep, lonely, but strangely hopeful. It wasn't sorrowful. It was curious, as if he had not lost himself, but grown into a version of himself no longer defined by noise. He had given up the surface of the world, but he had not vanished from it. His silence had become a kind of presence, felt, if not heard. The bishop, too, had grown through the pages. His early writings, structured and measured, gradually evolve into something more poetic, almost mystical. He spoke of light that doesn't shine, but reveals, and a flame that burns without fire. Over time, it became clear that their time beneath the cathedral was not passive. They were learning, observing, receiving. But from what, or whom, remained unsaid. The deeper they went, the less they tried to define it. It was as though the mystery itself had become sacred. Meanwhile, scholars and theologians around the world began dissecting the journals with urgency. Some claimed the voices were psychological projections. Others insisted the room was a metaphor, a constructed space where the subconscious could manifest. But for every theory, there was a contradiction. The writings were too aligned, too coherent, too intertwined to be delusion. And then there was the greatest mystery of all, how the two had survived for so long, with no visible supply lines, no explanation. And yet, not a single journal ever indicated hunger. One theory gained quiet traction, that the room beneath the cathedral was not physical in the way we understand, that the doorway found was not a passage down, but a passage into a sacred space that existed only for those called to it. Not everyone could enter. Not everyone was meant to. The cathedral, they said, had always had a second voice, one that only responded when someone stopped talking at it and began listening with it. A voice hidden in the silence between prayers, beneath the echo of bells. Maria, the architect who had first opened the room, wrote in her private notes, published posthumously, they weren't buried. They were planted. And what's growing now isn't legend. It's permission. Permission to believe that some places remain sacred not because they are holy in appearance, but because someone chose to sanctify them with attention, presence, and surrender. And now, for the first time in 40 years, the cathedral was no longer just a building. It had become a living threshold. The town's transformation deepened. The local school added a quiet room. No lessons, no rules, just a place for stillness. The library created a special section called the Listening Shelf, filled with anonymous reflections and transcribed journal excerpts. And every Friday, instead of morning announcements, the students would sit in silence for 13 minutes, one for each year of Thomas's life before he descended into the room. What began as solemnity turned into healing. Some cried, some wrote, some finally said the things they had buried for years. One letter, left anonymously at the cathedral, read, I don't know what I believe anymore, but when I'm quiet, I feel like someone's waiting for me to come home. That sentence echoed what many had begun to admit. This wasn't about doctrine or history. It was about longing. The same kind of longing that led the bishop to question his role. The same that led Thomas to follow him. And now, decades later, that longing had found its way into strangers who had never met them, yet felt they knew them deeply. Not everyone embraced the story. Some feared it, dismissing it as heresy or madness wrapped in mysticism. But even they could not deny the shift. The people were gentler, more present, more willing to sit with the discomfort of silence. The hollow that had once lived beneath their noise, the shame, the fear, the ache to always know, was beginning to wither. Because something stronger had taken root, a willingness to walk into mystery and not demand it make sense. An elderly woman, who had once been Thomas's neighbor, spoke at a gathering under the cathedral steps. She said, we used to think they were lost, but now I think we were, and they just went ahead of us. Her voice trembled not from sadness, but from clarity. It was as if the town had finally stopped trying to bring them back, and started walking toward where they had gone. Not physically, spiritually, slowly, step by step, breath by breath, into a silence that no longer meant absence, but invitation. And so the cathedral remained, not louder, not brighter, but deeper. People no longer came for closure. They came to open, to sit in the pews and feel the weight of what had been endured beneath them, to light candles not just for the missing, but for parts of themselves they had forgotten how to grieve. Because now they understood something Elijah had once written and Thomas had once lived. Some disappear not to be lost, but to make room for others to be found. As the years passed, the story of the bishop and the choirboy became more than a mystery. It became a movement, not grand or televised, but quiet, subtle, deeply personal. People began creating their own rooms beneath. Not physical spaces, but moments in their lives where they stepped away from noise and expectation. A woman in Ireland built a garden with no path, just a bench at the center where no one could reach her unless they truly listened. A man in Brazil started a monthly ritual of spending 1 hour in complete stillness with his children. No phones, no words, just presence. These weren't imitations. They were responses. Echoes of something ancient stirred awake by the journals, by the silence, by the room itself. A silence that no longer belonged only to the bishop and Thomas, but to everyone willing to sit with the questions that frightened them most. What if I'm not who I thought I was? What if love asks more than I'm prepared to give? What if truth is hidden not in answers, but in the willingness to wait? Back in the town, a new plaque was quietly placed beneath the altar. It bore no names, no dates, only 5 words. We remain because you forgot. And beneath that, in smaller letters, now remember. It wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation to remember the weight of presence, the beauty of restraint, the holiness of questions left unanswered. And most of all, the cost of turning away from something just because it doesn't fit the frame we were handed. One child, no older than 10, sat beneath the tree outside the cathedral and wrote in his notebook, "If I ever disappear, don't come find me. Just come sit beside where I was, and maybe I'll still be there." When asked by his mother why he wrote that, he replied, "Because some people don't go missing. They go quiet so others will listen." That boy had never read the journals. He hadn't memorized the history, but he felt it, and that was enough. And perhaps that's the greatest truth of all, that this story doesn't require belief or even full understanding. It only asks you to listen, to stay a little longer in the space where you usually rush, to let silence be more than a pause, to let mystery be more than discomfort. Because in that room beneath the cathedral, 2 lives chose stillness, and the world is only now beginning to catch up. There was one final journal found years after the others, hidden behind a loose stone in the farthest corner of the hidden room. It was smaller, bound in cloth, and written entirely in Thomas's hand. Most of its pages were blank. But on the very last page was a message that seemed meant for someone specific, but no name was written. It simply read, "If you've come looking for us, you're really looking for yourself. And if you found this, maybe you're ready to stop searching and start remembering." The discovery of that journal didn't make headlines. It wasn't photographed or published. The few who saw it agreed to leave it unshared, because it wasn't evidence. It was permission. And permission doesn't belong in glass cases or article quotes. It belongs in hearts, in decisions, in the quiet moments when we choose to lean into silence instead of numbing it. That little journal was not the end of a mystery. It was the continuation of a call. One only answered when we stopped shouting for answers and begin living the questions. At the heart of it all was not a bishop and not a choir boy, but a truth too big for certainty and too tender for spectacle. That the deepest transformations happen not when we are seen, but when we see ourselves in the unseen. That sacredness isn't reserved for holy titles or ancient stone, but for the everyday bravery of staying when it would be easier to run. The bishop knew this. Thomas lived this. And now, their silence was no longer lonely. It was shared. In a final act of humility, the town decided never to renovate the room again. The stairs were left undisturbed, the door resealed, not as an act of hiding, but of honoring. If it opened once, someone said, it will open again when we're ready. And that became the new rhythm of the place. Not trying to recreate the past, not trying to understand everything, just preparing themselves to hear, preparing their lives to be rooms others might step into, not to fix, but to find rest. And somewhere, beneath stone and silence, perhaps 2 chairs still sit, empty yet full, waiting not for visitors, but for a generation brave enough to understand why they were ever occupied. Not by saints, not by martyrs, but by 2 souls who gave up the world so the world might remember how to listen to what matters most. Not long after the final journal was quietly returned to its resting place, something remarkable happened. A group of visitors from different countries arrived at St. Agatha's Cathedral, none of them knowing one another, none of them planning to come together. Yet they all arrived on the same day. Each carried something small in their pocket, a stone, a folded letter, a drawing. Each said the same thing, in different words. I don't know why I'm here. I just knew I needed to come. It was as if the silence beneath the cathedral had called them, softly, slowly, and all at once. They sat scattered among the pews, unaware of each other's arrival, until a child began to hum. Not a song from the hymnal. Something older. Something familiar in a way that couldn't be traced. One by one, heads lifted, eyes met, and no one spoke. For nearly 20 minutes, they simply remained, united not by doctrine, but by ache. Ache for something true. Something worth carrying in a world that forgets too easily. That day, no words were exchanged. And yet, each person left knowing they had just witnessed a sermon. Across the world, others began reporting strange but gentle experiences. A mother in India said her deaf son began humming after sitting silently near a chapel. A man in Kenya woke up from a dream with a phrase on his tongue. They remained because we ran. A woman in Norway, who had lost her voice years earlier due to trauma, found herself whispering in her sleep. The silence is awake. These weren't hallucinations. They were threads stretched across time and soil, connecting people not through belief, but through remembrance. The journals were never formally published, but they continued to circulate, copied by hand, rewritten in personal notebooks, translated quietly from one language to another. Not altered, not expanded, just shared. The writings became less about what had happened, and more about what was still happening. What had begun in a hidden room beneath a cathedral had grown roots across continents, inside homes, behind eyes that had finally stopped searching long enough to see. And in all of this, across the world, across decades, the question that had once haunted a town had transformed. Not, where did they go, but, why did we leave? And more importantly, can we return? Not return to the room, not even to the cathedral, but to ourselves, to the part of us that still remembers what it means to sit in silence without trying to fill it, the part that aches when we forget, the part that knows we were never meant to run from mystery, but to walk beside it. At the 100th anniversary of the cathedral's cornerstone being laid, there was a gathering unlike any before. No speeches were planned, no choir scheduled, just a simple invitation sent to those who had followed the journals, those who had once lit candles beneath the altar, and those who had carried this story in silence for years. The invitation read, "Come if you wish. Bring nothing but your presence." Hundreds came. Some walked. Some traveled oceans. Some arrived alone. But they came as if drawn by gravity, not to be seen, but to witness. On that morning, the church bells did not ring. And still, everyone inside rose at the same time. Together, they stood in silence. The floor creaked. The air held its breath. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the temperature changed. Not cold, not warm, just aware. It was the kind of stillness that doesn't come from absence, but from attention. And in that stillness, someone began to cry. Not out of sorrow, out of recognition. Because what they felt wasn't just the memory of two lost souls. It was themselves, finally returned. An elder stepped forward and placed a blank page on the altar. Then a child placed a stone beside it. Then others followed. Leaves, drawings, whispers written on scraps of cloth. Nothing organized, nothing planned, just presence expressed in physical form. And when the last item had been laid down, a small draft swept through the room and lifted the blank page just enough to flip it once, then let it rest. There were no miracles that day, no apparitions, only the soft sound of humanity becoming sacred again. Later, someone found a note tucked into a pew and signed. It read, "We are not waiting for a return. We are learning how to stay." That line was passed from hand to hand, etched onto walls and homes, sewn into jacket linings, carried in wallets. Because it spoke not of conclusion, but of continuation. The real power of what happened beneath St. Agatha's was not in what was hidden, but in what it awakened. The permission to be unfinished, the courage to be quietly faithful. And so, even as the world spun faster, even as noise pressed and louder, the legacy of the hidden room endured, not in stained glass or statues, but in those willing to live differently, to live as if the unseen matters, to live as if listening were holy, and to live as if, at any moment, beneath the surface of ordinary life, a door might open, not into escape, but into presence, into purpose, into the echo of a silence still alive, still waiting, still willing to speak. Years after the silent gathering, a group of students studying comparative theology made a pilgrimage to St. Agatha's. Most were skeptical, curious, but not convinced. They had read fragments of the journals, heard whispers of the boy and the bishop, but believed the story had been romanticized over time. Still they came, not to believe, but to observe. What they found changed them in ways none of them could explain. They spent 2 days inside the cathedral. No tours, no lectures, just stillness, just time. On the second night, one student, Elena, woke in her guest quarters, overcome with the urge to go sit near the altar. She said later she didn't know why. There was no sound, no light, just a quiet sense of invitation. When she arrived, she found a single candle flickering, though no one had lit it. There, on the pew in front of her, lay a journal. Not an original, a blank one, waiting. She opened to the first page and, without understanding why, wrote, "I don't know if I believe, but I'm here, and maybe that's enough." The next morning, every student had a similar story. Each had been drawn to a different place in the cathedral during the night. Each had found a blank journal, and each had written something they had never dared say aloud. When they gathered to compare their entries, a strange pattern emerged. The final sentence in every journal was the same, though written in different languages, phrased in different ways. The words were, "What if the silence is waiting for my voice?" It was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Their professor, a lifelong academic and critic of mysticism, sat in silence for an hour after hearing their stories. Then, with tears in his eyes, he said, "I've spent my whole life studying belief, but maybe I forgot how to let it study me." That single sentence shifted the course of his work forever. He returned to the university and retired from teaching 2 months later. In his final public lecture, he said, "The deepest truths aren't taught. They're trusted, and that trust begins in silence." From that day forward, the cathedral became a place not of pilgrimage, but of permission. Visitors were no longer coming to find something. They were coming to be found, not by history, not by relics, but by a voice they didn't yet know they carried. The bishop and the boy had never asked to be followed, but their willingness to disappear had shown others how to finally arrive. In a coastal village thousands of miles away, a woman named Anya began creating sculptures out of driftwood. She didn't consider herself an artist. She was grieving the loss of her father and had no words to express the ache. Then one day, while reading a translated excerpt from Thomas's journal, she read the line, "Sometimes, silence makes a shape inside you." She stood up, walked to the shore, and began collecting pieces of wood the tide had left behind. She didn't know what she was building. She just knew she wasn't alone. Each sculpture was different. Some resembled doorways. Others looked like open hands. A few were so abstract they defied language. She placed them along the shoreline with no signs, no explanations. Travelers began stopping by, standing in front of them, and often sitting down, just sitting. A movement was born not from art, but from atmosphere. People began referring to it as the listening coast. And one thing echoed through the journal entries visitors left behind. "It feels like the space is waiting for something sacred to arrive. Maybe me." Back at St. Agatha's, a new generation of caretakers took their place, not as leaders, but as stewards of presence. They didn't preach. They didn't publish. They kept the doors open. They kept the candles stocked. And they kept reading the journals, not to interpret, but to remember. In a world rushing faster every day, this small group had chosen to slow down enough to feel. And in that choice, they became more than keepers of a cathedral. They became protectors of the space between the noise. One of them, a man named Jonah, once said, "We are not trying to preserve the past. We're preparing the world to receive it when it returns. Not through miracles, not through spectacle, but through daily courage, through quiet conversations, long pauses, and the kind of faith that doesn't demand proof to keep walking." Jonah would often sit for hours by the door to the hidden stairwell, not hoping for it to open again, but grateful it once had, because that was the real legacy of the hidden room, not what happened inside of it, but what it made possible outside of it. The silence that once held two souls had become a teacher to thousands. It had shown them that some disappear not to escape, but to become something others will one day need. And when they are ready, not for answers, but for awakening, they'll find the doorway was never locked, only waiting for someone who remembered how to knock. A documentarian from New Zealand once visited St. Agatha's, intending to create a film about religious architecture. But when she entered the cathedral, something shifted. The arches, the stained glass, even the stone, all of it felt like it was breathing. She spent the first 2 days just listening, not interviewing, not recording, just watching the way people moved, how they lowered their voices not out of obligation, but reverence. And on the third day, she abandoned her original script entirely. Instead, she began filming silence. Long, uninterrupted shots of candlelight flickering, of people sitting with eyes closed, of hands brushing over journal pages, not to analyze, but to connect. Her final film had no narration, no interviews, just 52 minutes of quiet presence. It was shown once, at a private screening, and those who watched it said they walked out slower, as if their own breath had joined a rhythm they'd long forgotten. The film was never released to the public. She said it wasn't meant to be watched. It was meant to be felt. One reviewer, who had attended the screening, wrote a single sentence in his column. "If this is what faith looks like, perhaps I've known it all along." That sentence rippled far beyond the page. It was quoted in letters, sermons, journal entries, even tattoos, because it named something that had been buried under centuries of noise. That faith might not be found in certainty, but in the simple, stubborn decision to remain present when the world demands you look away. In that quiet revelation, St. Agatha's story reached places no cathedral walls could contain. Monks in Nepal began including silence walks in their daily ritual, inspired by the tale of the hidden room. A prison in Argentina introduced a room of stillness, modeled after what they had read. And even in war zones, soldiers reported finding solace by drawing open doors on walls, small sketches that symbolized the invitation to return to themselves, even amidst chaos. So the mystery that once centered on a disappearance had become a compass pointing people back to what was never lost. The bishop and the boy hadn't left a map. They had become the silence between lines, the breath between words, the pause before choice. And in doing so, they taught the world the most radical kind of presence, the kind that doesn't need to be seen to be real. In the heart of Berlin, a playwright named Emil heard the story secondhand from a traveler who had passed through St. Agatha's. At first, he dismissed it as folklore, too poetic to be true. But that night, he dreamed of a staircase descending into candlelight, and a boy's voice whispering, "If the world forgets me, I still remember it." Emil woke with tears on his cheeks and began writing before the sun rose. What emerged was a play with no characters, no dialogue, just a setting, a quiet room beneath a forgotten church, and a single chair facing an empty wall. For 90 minutes, the audience sat in silence as lights shifted slowly, as ambient sounds of wind and footsteps passed outside the stage's borders. Some people left, some wept, and a few stayed long after the play ended, unsure if it had ended. One woman wrote in the guest book, "I didn't watch a story. I remembered one I had buried." The play toured once, then Emil retired it permanently. He said it wasn't meant to be performed more than a few times. "Too much light spoils the sacred," he explained, "and this story belongs to the shadows." Those words became a mantra for artists, seekers, and wanderers alike, not out of darkness, but out of respect for the unseen, the unspoken, the sacred silence that doesn't ask to be filled, but simply honored. Around this time, an old woman who had once been a student of the bishop came forward with a letter she had kept hidden for over 60 years. It was addressed to whoever waits long enough to care. Inside, the bishop had written a single phrase, "Not every voice needs to echo to be eternal." The paper was worn, almost falling apart, but the ink remained intact, as if the words themselves had waited patiently for a world finally ready to hear them. And now, more than a century since two souls disappeared beneath stone, the real legacy lives not in answers, but in awakenings. Not in relics, but in reverence. Not in proving anything to the world, but in giving the world back the gift of wonder. The kind that kneels without kneeling, that listens without needing to respond. that remembers what silence has always known. That presence is enough. In a remote mountain town in Peru, a teacher named Mariella began noticing a change in her students. They had become restless, disconnected, distracted. So, inspired by a worn translation of one of the journals, she introduced a new tradition. Every Friday afternoon, the classroom would become a place of stillness. No lessons, no talking, just a single candle on her desk and space to breathe. At first, the children fidgeted. Some giggled, some resisted. But slowly, week by week, something began to shift. Without being asked, the students began bringing small objects to place near the candle. A drawing, a stone, a folded note. No one explained what they were offering, and no one needed to. The silence spoke louder than any explanation. One day, a boy who had never spoken in class left behind a piece of paper with just 4 words, "I don't feel broken." That simple sentence rippled through the town like a hymn. And soon, other schools followed, not out of obligation, but out of a shared hunger for stillness. Mariella said later, "We didn't teach peace. We made room for it." That became her legacy, not test scores or awards, but a generation of children who knew how to sit with themselves, who learned that not all questions demand answers, that sometimes healing begins when we stop trying to explain the wound. The journals hadn't given her a method. They had given her permission. And in a noisy world, permission to be quiet was the rarest kind of gift. Word of her classroom spread far beyond the town. A photo of the candlelit desk made its way online, captioned simply, "Even the smallest flame can teach the dark to wait." It was shared millions of times, not as a trend, not as a meme, but as a reminder that what began beneath stone and silence had not faded. It had only changed form, from hidden room to open hearts, from lost voices to quiet courage, from mystery to movement. The teacher and her students never visited St. Agatha's, but they didn't need to, because they had already found what mattered. The sacred space inside themselves where wonder lives, unafraid of not knowing, where stillness is not absence, but presence amplified, where the whisper of a story once buried is now part of how they breathe. Elsewhere, in the vast solitude of the Australian outback, an aging shepherd named Lewis had lived decades with only the sky and sheep as company. He'd lost his wife young and had no children, but in his solitude he had found something he never named, only felt. One day, a traveler passed through, seeking shelter from a storm. Lewis shared fire, food, and silence. That night, the traveler mentioned the story of St. Agatha's hidden room, unaware that Lewis already knew. From a rusted metal tin under his bed, Lewis pulled out a journal. It wasn't one of the originals, but a handmade copy passed down from another traveler 30 years earlier. The edges were curled. The ink had faded, but the words still breathed. Lewis read one aloud. "You are not forgotten by silence. You are remembered in it." The traveler listened with wide eyes, and in the stillness between them, something ancient stirred, like dust waking under moonlight. Lewis said little else that night. He simply handed the journal over, then stared into the fire. In the morning, the traveler left, carrying more than just words. He carried presence. That night under the stars, Lewis smiled for the first time in years, whispering, "I'm not alone out here." Not really. And the wind, as if understanding, curled gently around him like a response. Stories of the bishop and the choirboy had traveled across oceans, languages, generations, not by force, but by invitation. They were not commands. They were questions, left open like doors. And those doors were finding homes in desert huts, prison cells, quiet gardens, hospital beds. Not because the story demanded belief, but because it reminded people that they could still believe in something. And that something wasn't about answers. It was about aliveness. A quiet, rooted aliveness that exists beneath noise, beyond pain, inside the marrow of being. It had begun in 1956 with a disappearance. But what disappeared wasn't lost. It had only taken another form. Silence as presence, mystery as guide, and remembrance as the sacred act of not forgetting who we are. In a village along the coast of Norway, a retired sailor named Henrik turned the front room of his home into what he called the listening library. There were no books, no chairs, only cushions, candles, and soft, ambient echoes of waves playing through a small speaker. On the door, a sign read, "Come in. Say nothing. Leave with what you didn't know you were missing." Henrik had no training in theology or philosophy, but he had lived. He had listened to the sea long enough to know when something sacred was speaking. One afternoon, a woman entered trembling. She was carrying a folded note and holding her breath as if words might collapse her. She sat, wept, and never unfolded the paper. After an hour, she placed it under a candle and left without a sound. Henrik never opened it. That was not his role. But from that day forward, more and more strangers arrived, not seeking advice, but seeking the quiet that allows truth to surface on its own. The hidden room beneath the cathedral had never told people what to do. It had simply reminded them that stillness knows what we've forgotten. The listening library became more than a space. It became a ritual. Visitors returned year after year, even in silence. One child, no older than 7, wrote in a guest book, "I don't know what this place is, but my heart felt full and soft like warm bread." That line was printed in a local newspaper and soon reached the global press. Not because it was eloquent, but because it was true. The truth people didn't know they needed until they heard it from a child who had no agenda, only presence. Henrik passed away, quietly in his sleep at the age of 89. His neighbors lit candles on the steps of his home, and the village chose not to turn the listening library into a museum or shrine. Instead, they kept it exactly as it was, open, simple, and silent. Because some legacies aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to continue. Just as the bishop and the boy had never sought to be known, Henrik had only wished for the world to remember how to listen again. And so, the thread from a hidden room beneath an ancient cathedral had now woven itself through oceans, deserts, cities, and hearts. Not with fanfare, not with doctrine, but with the quiet insistence of a presence that refuses to die. A presence that waits not to be worshipped, but welcomed. And in every place it touched, it left the same mark, the sound of a soul remembering who it was before the noise. In the archives of a nearly forgotten monastery in southern Italy, a monk named Paolo was restoring old manuscripts when he came across something strange. A fragment of a letter tucked behind a binding, sealed with wax and written in faded ink. It wasn't signed, but its final line mirrored what had been found in Thomas's last journal. "Let silence not be the absence of sound, but the presence of God." Paolo froze. He had read of St. Agatha's mystery, but he hadn't believed it had reached this far. He spent the next weeks following the letter's trail, consulting linguistic experts, historians, even a musicologist. The style of writing matched that of the bishop. The phrasing echoed the boy's journal. But what astounded him most was that the ink was not local. It came from the same forest known to hold the ancient tree where the sermon notes were found decades earlier. How had this fragment reached Italy? Why was it hidden so deliberately? And who had sealed it, knowing someone one day might listen deeply enough to find it? Paolo didn't seek to solve the puzzle. Instead, he placed the letter in a small alcove within the monastery, open for anyone to see. And beneath it, he carved a phrase into the wood. "What begins in hiding may bloom in the open when the world is ready." Pilgrims began visiting, not to read history, but to feel remembered by it. Many arrived silent, many left weeping, and some, it said, heard music in the walls. A harmony soft as breath, strong as grief, steady as grace. So the journey that began with a bishop and a boy disappearing in 1956 had not ended. It had only multiplied across generations, languages, and lifetimes. It had become a song passed between strangers who had never met, a light that flickered through doubt, a doorway for those who thought they were too late. And in the quiet echo of this story, the most beautiful truth emerged, that even in loss, something sacred survives, not in explanation, but in presence. And now, to those who still wonder what happened in that hidden room beneath the cathedral, the answer no longer matters. Because the room is not just under stone, it is inside each person who dares to sit still long enough to listen, to believe not in answers, but in awakenings, to trust not what they see, but what they feel, and in doing so, to join a story that was never about being found, but about finally remembering we were never truly lost. In a hospice center in Dublin, A volunteer nurse named Ashling began reading excerpt from the bishop's sermon notes to patients in their final days. She never preached. She never even told them the full story. But her voice, gentle and unrushed, would speak words like, "You were never forgotten. You were held in the silence, long before the world knew your name." The reactions were profound. Some patients smiled faintly. Others closed their eyes, a tear escaping quietly. A few whispered, "I remember." One man, silent for weeks, suddenly spoke after hearing a line from the notes. "The sacred does not knock. It waits inside you." He opened his eyes and said, "I saw a boy, holding a candle in the dark." He passed away hours later, peaceful. Ashling didn't try to interpret these moments. She only created space for them. Her role wasn't to explain or decode. It was simply to offer presence, to carry fragments of something larger, and let them land where they were needed most. The center became known as the Quiet Threshold. Word spread, and soon other hospices adopted the idea, bringing in silence as medicine, not absence. Ashling trained volunteers across Europe, always reminding them that their power lay not in speaking, but in being with. Because when someone is near the end of life, they're not asking for answers. They're reaching for reminders that their story, however messy or unfinished, still matters, still echoes. Eventually, one of the bishop's original lines was inscribed above the entrance to the hospice. "The last breath is not an ending, but a return." And visitors, even those grieving, would pause before passing under it. Some touched the inscription as if it pulsed. Others bowed their heads, and many left letters at the base of the wall, not addressed to the bishop or the choir boy, but to the silence itself. Letters that said, "Thank you for holding them until I could." And so the story crossed one more threshold, becoming not just legacy, but companion. A quiet, invisible hand resting on the shoulder of those who feared they were walking alone. Because in the places where words no longer suffice, the memory of that hidden room lives on, not as architecture, but as grace. Meanwhile, in a subway station beneath Tokyo, an installation artist named Ray created a living mural that spanned 3 walls. It had no color, no signature, just shifting panels of light and shadow that changed based on the silence of those who passed. The quieter the space, the more vivid the images became. And at the heart of it all, carved faintly into steel, were words inspired by the Cathedral journals. "You are standing inside a story that remembers you." At first, commuters didn't understand. They rushed past, earbuds in, eyes down. But slowly, they began to notice. When the platform was quiet, the mural shimmered. When voices softened, the walls glowed. One day, a child pointed and said, "It's breathing." That single sentence was enough. Over time, the station became a sacred pause in the city's rush. Strangers began lingering longer. Some sat, others cried, and in the stillness, they began to feel something ancient moving, not around them, but within. Ray never revealed how the mural worked. She only said, "It listens better than we do." The mural became known globally as the breathing wall. People traveled across continents to experience it, not understand it, but to let it understand them. There were no plaques, no explanations, just the quiet suggestion that wonder still had a place in the modern world. That sacredness didn't belong only to old cathedrals. It could live beneath streets, between footsteps, inside moments we're taught to ignore. One morning, a violinist began playing beside the mural, not loudly, but as if offering the music to something invisible. A crowd gathered, but no one spoke. The mural pulsed gently with their presence, and when the violinist finished, she bowed, not to applause, but to the silence itself. That moment was captured in a photo that later went viral with the caption, "This is what it means to be witnessed by the unseen." Through her creation, Ray reminded the world of a truth buried since 1956, that what vanished beneath St. Agatha's had not died. It had simply taken root in places where stillness was still allowed to speak. And from the quiet breath of stone to the glowing heart of steel, the story carried on, alive, listening, waiting for those who dare to pause long enough to hear what only silence can say. In the highlands of Kenya, a midwife named Wamboe had built her life around the rhythm of new beginnings. Her work was filled with breath, sweat, and cries, the raw entrance of life into a world often too loud to greet it properly. But Womboe believed that every birth was more than biology. To her, each child arrived carrying the echo of something older, something sacred. After reading a translated passage from the bishop's journal, what begins in silence carries the voice of eternity. She began placing a moment of stillness between the birth cry and the first word spoken. This silent pause, only a few seconds long, became a ritual. Mothers would hold their babies in silence, their foreheads touching, the room hushed. Nurses would stop, lights would dim, and in that breath between worlds, a different kind of language emerged. Not one of knowledge, but of knowing. Womboe noticed that even the most anxious mothers softened. Some wept without knowing why. Others simply smiled, as if hearing something no one else could. One evening, a mother who had lost her previous 2 children gave birth in Womboe's clinic. When the child was placed in her arms, she held him close and whispered, "You made it through the silence." Those words became the title of a documentary that later shared Womboe's practice with the world. Viewers across continents were moved, not just by the births, but by the reverence given to those first moments. It wasn't about religion. It was about remembering that life, in its purest form, is introduced not by noise, but by presence. Womboe would later say in an interview, "The world shouts too quickly, but souls, especially new ones, deserve to be welcomed by listening." Her words echoed far beyond the villages, into hospitals, birthing centers, even orphanages, where the ritual of silence began to take root. Not as policy, but as prayer. A gentle defiance against a world that forgets how to greet its own miracles. And each time that silence was honored, the hidden room beneath St. Agatha's breathed again. The sacred thread of the bishop's disappearance continued to weave itself through places no one expected. It didn't ask for cathedrals or ceremony. It asked only for pause, for stillness, for the bravery to welcome the unknown with open arms. And in every new beginning, it whispered the same truth. Even in the chaos of arrival, silence remembers where you came from. In a remote prison on the edge of Siberia, a man named Yuri spent 30 years in isolation. His crimes were grave, his sentence lifelong. He hadn't spoken to another soul in over a decade. But one day, a new chaplain arrived, a young woman who brought no Bible, no sermons, only a small worn journal. It wasn't labeled. It had no cover. But inside were copied passages from the hidden room's writings. The chaplain didn't read them aloud. She simply slid the journal through the bars and said, "There are words in here that once waited in silence too." Yuri at first ignored it. Then, out of boredom or curiosity, he opened it, and the first line read, "You are more than what you've done. You are what you dare to remember." He closed the book, but the next night, he opened it again, and slowly, something began to thaw. The silence in his cell began to feel less like punishment and more like space. Not empty space, but space that held possibility. Not for freedom from prison, but for freedom within it. Over the next months, Yuri began to write. Not confessions, not apologies, but questions, letters, thoughts, fragments. He addressed them not to the chaplain, nor to God, but to the room, the one beneath St. Agatha's, to the boy who once sang, to the bishop who vanished. He imagined them reading his words, not judging them, just holding them. One page at a time, he stitched himself back into the world, not by erasing his past, but by remembering he was still here. The chaplain never pressured him. She only left the journal and returned weekly to collect the new pages he had written. She never opened them in front of him. She only nodded gently, as if to say, "This silence is holding you too." And one day, Yuri left a final note. "For the first time in 3 decades, I don't feel like a ghost." That page was later translated and read aloud at a human rights conference. It was met with silence, and then quiet tears. In that cold, forgotten place, a story buried beneath stone had found its way into the heart of a man buried by time. Not to redeem him, but to remind him he was still reachable. And so, from the cathedral to the cell, from the sacred to the condemned, the thread endured. Not because it shouted, but because it waited. Because in every shadow, there is a place where silence still remembers your name. In the vast desert of New Mexico, an astronomer named Lillian spent her nights gazing into the silence between stars. Her observatory was remote, surrounded by miles of sand and sky. For decades, she mapped constellations, tracked comets, and listened for cosmic signals that rarely came. But it wasn't until she stumbled across an old article, one recounting the hidden room beneath the cathedral, that she began to sense something familiar. The way the story described silence, it mirrored her own. The sky, like the stone chamber, was a vault of mystery. But both somehow spoke. One night, while cataloging the death of a distant star, Lillian remembered a line from the bishop's recovered writings. Not all ends are collapse. Some are transformation. She whispered it into the cold of the dome, and for the first time, felt as though the universe had answered. Not with light or sound, but with presence. A subtle shift in her own perception, a quiet knowing that everything she watched was not empty, but pregnant with unseen memory. Moved, she began adding handwritten notes to her star charts, verses, reflections, and even questions inspired by the lost Choirboy's journal. Her colleagues found it odd. Some mocked her, but those who stayed to read were touched in ways they couldn't explain. Scientists aren't taught to feel meaning in data, but Lillian showed them how wonder could live even in the numbers. She would often say, "The cathedral pointed down. My telescope points up, but we're both looking for the same thing." Eventually, she hosted night vigils open to the public, silent sky-watching events under the stars. No talking, no telescopes, just blankets, candles, and the ancient feeling of looking into forever. At each event, she read a passage from the sermon notes aloud, not to preach, but to invite. And as people lay beneath the stars, many said they felt a presence, not watching from above, but rising gently from within. The story had reached the sky now. Its silence traveled across galaxies, echoed in starlight, folded itself into the hum of time. And as it did, it proved something beautiful. That mystery doesn't diminish us. It deepens us. That silence isn't absence. It's the sacred waiting to be recognized. And in that vastness, the thread from the cathedral found a new home, stitched into the fabric of stars. In the shadowed hills of northern Wales, a young boy named Emrys was born without speech. Doctors called it mutism. His family called it quiet soul. He never uttered a word, not out of fear, but because he didn't seem to need to. He listened, watched, and felt more deeply than those twice his age. When he was 10, he stumbled upon an old recording of a choral piece titled St. Agatha's Requiem, composed by an anonymous monk inspired by the tale of the missing bishop and boy. Emrys listened once and wept. From that day, he would sit in the garden, replaying the melody through headphones, drawing shapes in the dirt that only he understood. His parents, desperate to connect, began researching the cathedral story, hoping to understand the source of his obsession. What they found moved them deeply. When they whispered lines from the journals to him, "You are not broken. You are unspoken beauty." Emery smiled, and for the first time, he held their hands without hesitation. One day, during a school assembly, Emery stood unexpectedly. With shaking fingers, he played a recording of the choral piece for his classmates. No one understood why, but by the end, the room was silent. Not awkwardly, but reverently. And when the final note faded, one girl whispered, "I felt like I remembered something from before I was born." From that moment, the children treated Emrys not as strange, but as someone who had touched something holy. A local therapist heard of the story and interviewed Emrys' family, later writing an article titled "The Language of the Unsung." The piece went viral, not because of medical curiosity, but because of the gentle idea at its center, that some souls speak through resonance, not vocabulary. That maybe silence, when held with reverence, becomes a deeper kind of voice. And through Emrys, the tale of the hidden room didn't just reach the voiceless, it became their voice. So now, in playgrounds and churches and care centers, the song of the lost bishop and choirboy echoes not through sound, but through the stillness they once embodied. And in every child who cannot speak yet sees the world with wide, timeless eyes, the story lives on, not as folklore, but as evidence that silence has messengers too. And sometimes they arrive not with sermons, but with presence. In a monastery tucked deep within the forests of Romania, an aging monk named Brother Mihai had spent decades restoring ancient manuscripts by hand. He barely interacted with the outside world, speaking only when necessary, and always in whispers. His hands, weathered by ink and time, held a patience few could comprehend. One rainy evening, he received a package from an archivist in Italy. Inside it, a copy of the sermon notes found beneath St. Agatha's Cathedral. He opened the first page, read one line, and gently closed his eyes. They were waiting for someone who wouldn't rush past the sacred. For weeks, Brother Mihai copied each passage in silence, one letter at a time. But he didn't transcribe mechanically. Between lines, he left invisible prayers, soft intentions embedded in the ink, like echoes behind every sentence. What emerged was not just a manuscript. It was an act of devotion, a sacred reweaving. And when it was done, he placed it in the monastery's library, not in a glass case, but on a worn wooden shelf, where any hand could reach it without fear or formality. One spring morning, a young woman named Anya, visiting from a nearby village, stumbled upon the manuscript while sheltering from the rain. She opened to the middle and read, "The door to God is not always in the chapel. It is in the pause between questions." She began to cry quietly. She hadn't come for answers. She had come to hide. But the words made her feel seen. Later, she would tell her priest, "That book didn't tell me what to believe. It reminded me I still could." Word of the manuscript spread slowly. Pilgrims began arriving not for miracles, but for space. The monastery didn't advertise it. There was no website, only a bench near the door, a warm cup of tea, and the silent weight of something holy resting on simple pages. For many, that was enough. Not to be told, but to be held, to be gently folded back into a story they had forgotten they were part of. Brother Mihai never sought recognition. He only smiled when visitors wept, as if he understood their silence more than their words. And in that quiet forest, where trees breathed and bells whispered through fog, the story of the vanished bishop and choirboy became more than history. It became shelter, not because it was loud, but because it lasted. On a cold November day in Montreal, a high school teacher named Mr. Desjardins handed his students a writing assignment. Describe a place you've never seen, but feel like you remember. The room buzzed with confusion. But one student, Leah, wrote 3 pages in a single sitting. Her essay described a candlelit room beneath stone, the smell of old wood, and the feeling of a hand resting gently on her shoulder, though no one was there. When he asked her how she imagined such a place, she shrugged and whispered, "I don't know. It just felt like home." Curious, Mr. Desjardins searched for similar imagery online and stumbled upon an archived article detailing the hidden room found under St. Agatha's Cathedral. The descriptions matched Leah's nearly word for word. He was shaken, not with fear but awe. How could a 16-year-old in Canada write so intimately about a place lost for 4 decades? He printed the article and gave it to her. She read in silence, then looked up and said, "I think I dreamed it before I was born." From that day, Mr. Desjardins incorporated lessons about memory, sacred spaces, and silence into his curriculum. He didn't speak of religion. He spoke of resonance, of places that live in us before we know their names. Students responded with stories of dreams, déjà vu, and feelings they had never dared to voice. And in a classroom once filled with noise and distraction, a reverent hush began to settle during these discussions, as if something ancient was sitting among them, listening. Each year, he ended the semester by playing a soft instrumental piece inspired by the choirboy's final song. No lyrics, just harmony. And while it played, he asked his students to write letters, not to anyone specific, but to the silence itself. The letters were never collected, never graded, but students always thanked him afterward. Many said it was the first time they had felt seen without needing to be understood. Through a teacher's curiosity and a teenager's mysterious memory, the hidden room found its way into a modern classroom, without fanfare, without doctrine, just presence. And in that room filled with fluorescent lights and restless energy, the old cathedral's breath exhaled once more, quietly, powerfully, reminding each soul that even across oceans, languages, and time, the sacred still remembers who you are. In Tokyo, Nestled between concrete towers and neon lights, an elderly man named Hiroshi ran a small repair shop for old radios. He believed that sound held memory, not just in music, but in the static, the distortion, the silent hum between stations. One night, while restoring a radio from the 1950s, he stumbled upon an AM frequency that pulsed softly with a faint melody. It was distant, incomplete, almost like a song searching for someone to finish it. He didn't recognize the tune, but it stirred something deep and unspoken. The next day, Hiroshi returned to the signal, adjusting dials millimeter by millimeter. Eventually, he captured more, not just melody, but a fragment of a voice. Gentle, young, singing words he couldn't fully understand, but felt like a prayer. When a translator friend visited, she recognized part of the language, Latin, and one line, in particular, stood out: Lux perpetua lucit eis. Let perpetual light shine upon them. They cross-referenced it, and it matched a choral arrangement said to be lost with the disappearance of the choirboy. News of Hiroshi's find spread through a quiet network of musicians and archivists. Soon, a group of composers from around the world began collaborating with him, layering instruments to rebuild the forgotten melody from fragments. They didn't want to commercialize it. They only wanted to finish what was started. Together, they released a single instrumental piece titled The Room Beneath. It was uploaded without credits. No names, no story, just the music. But within weeks, people who listened reported vivid dreams, memories they couldn't place, a sense of recognition without explanation. One woman wrote anonymously, "I didn't know what the song was about, but when it ended, I cried like I remembered someone I had loved and lost before I was even born." The track became a phenomenon, not because of virality, but because of intimacy. It became a spiritual thread shared quietly between strangers who knew nothing of each other, yet felt connected through silence and sound. And so, through the hum of an old radio, the story reached its most ethereal form: music, a language older than words, a signal that didn't need explanation to be understood. And in that transmission, across time zones and hearts, the echo of the bishop and the choirboy lived on, not in doctrine or stone, but in the sacred vibrations between longing and memory. Years later, in a gallery on the outskirts of Florence, an artist named Isabella unveiled her latest installation, a life-sized replica of the hidden room beneath St. Agatha's Cathedral, built entirely from translucent paper and ash. The walls glowed softly. The organ was reduced to skeletal lines. And instead of music, the only sound in the space was the gentle breath of air passing through the paper folds. No plaques, no explanations, only one phrase etched at the entrance: "Some absences hold more presence than presence itself." Visitors came expecting spectacle, but found stillness. They entered whispering, not knowing why. Children clutched their parents' hands. Elderly couples sat for hours, unmoving. Some knelt, some wept. Others simply breathed slower, their hearts sinking with a rhythm that had no name. One reviewer wrote, "I didn't walk through a room. I walked through a memory that never belonged to me, but somehow was mine." Isabella had been haunted by the story since childhood, though she never fully understood why. Only when she saw a photo of the original key, the rusted one found under the choirboy's remains, did the images flood her dreams. She spent 3 years creating the installation, never speaking publicly of its origin. She wanted the experience to remain open, unclaimed. She believed the room belonged not to the past, but to whoever needed it in the present. Eventually, she left a journal by the exit for visitors to write in. Pages filled quickly, not with reviews, but with confessions, memories, prayers, and dreams. Some entries came from as far as Argentina, Syria, and Ghana. Many began with the same sentence: "I don't know why I'm writing this, but..." And in that shared anonymity, the story became complete. Not because it was solved, but because it was shared. And so the tale ended not with answers, but with invitation. The bishop and the choirboy were never found in the way the world expected, but their silence traveled through ink, voice, stillness, sky, song, and space, until it reached everyone. In the end, the hidden room beneath the cathedral was not a place to discover. It was a truth to remember, that the most powerful stories do not scream. They wait, quietly, for you. In the end, the story of the bishop and the choir boy is not simply about a disappearance, or even a hidden room beneath a cathedral. It is about what lingers in the silence when voices vanish, what breathes through forgotten prayers and half-finished songs. Across 30, 40, 50 years, their absence echoed louder than any presence. And somehow, in that long, aching stillness, humanity found pieces of itself, scattered across continents, stitched into letters, dreams, music, and quiet acts of remembrance. Their story did not end in 1956. It began there. From a locked room beneath stone to classrooms, forests, radios, and galleries, their legacy moved not through explanation, but through emotion, through what we felt but could not name, through the deep, universal yearning for meaning, connection, and sacredness in a world that often forgets to pause. And as the years passed, their presence became less about who they were, and more about who we become when we allow mystery to soften us, when we make space for what cannot be seen, only felt. This is the truth we so often overlook, that some stories were never meant to be solved, only held, that some questions are wholly simply because they remain unanswered, and that the weight of silence is not always emptiness, but invitation. The bishop and the choir boy may have vanished from the world's records, but their light was never extinguished. It changed shape. It entered people. It became part of how we remember what matters when everything else fades. So tonight, as you sit with this story still echoing in your chest, perhaps ask yourself, where is the hidden room in me? What song waits to be heard in my own silence? You don't need to have answers. You only need to listen. Because the sacred doesn't arrive with thunder. It whispers. And the greatest discoveries are never made by the eyes, but by the soul. If this story found a place inside you, let it live a little longer. Leave a comment sharing what moved you. Subscribe to this channel to receive more stories that echo with depth and wonder. And if you feel someone else needs to hear this, someone searching, grieving, remembering, share it. Because sometimes the quietest truths need only a single voice to be remembered again.